that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the prince of Israel, was walking out of Yerushalayim together with Rabbi Yeshua, who was a colleague of his, but he was greater because he was the prince of Israel. And Rabbi Yeshua says to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, woe to us that we no longer have the temple. It's in ruins. We have no longer the location to be atoned, to bring the sacrifices. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says to him, don't be so despondent. We have an atonement mechanism, which is equivalent of bringing sacrifices. And what is that? Gemilas Chesed, doing acts of love and kindness. And he cited a verse. God says, I asked for Chesed, not for the sacrifice. I just want to elaborate what I said yesterday. The second temple was destroyed. Why? Sinas Chinam, unwarranted hate. If the Jews would have been committed to Chesed, just Chesed, not anything else, they would have been concerned about one another. If you're concerned about one another, what is an expression of that? There's a positive commandment in Torah. A Jew must love his fellow as he loves himself. Meaning what you do for yourself, you do for the other. So if they were truly committed to Chesed, doing acts of loving kindness, and I don't feel like something's been taken from me, but I feel that I'm growing and I am the beneficiary when I do Chesed for someone else, you wouldn't have sinas chinam. You wouldn't have unwarranted hate. The root of many things that we do is due to it's me and you, rather than us. Moshe Rabbeinu says before he passes away, there's a portion of Torah towards the end of Devarim, the name of the portion is Nitzovim. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Jewish people, Atem Nitzovim hayom kulchem. Today you all stand together. Today you will stand unified. So the Midrash says, what's the inference of that? If you unified, you stand. If you divided, you fall. That's what Moshe said to Jewish people. The most important thing is to be unified, to be committed to one another. The moment you become fractionalized, the whole structure falls apart. What is a unifying factor? If people are interested in doing chesed with one another, that means we care about one another. We don't take from one another. We give rather than take. We don't speak negatively about one another. Because that's not doing something positive, that's negative. What's the value of a sacrifice if it's you and him rather than us? God says, I don't want the korban. I don't want the zebach. I don't want the sacrifice. What do I want? Chesed chavatz. I want the chesed. If you would have chesed, the temple would have never been destroyed. There's a Jerusalem Talmud, which Chavetz Chaim cites in regard to Lashon Hara, speaking negative of one another. David Melech was the most special king of Israel. We say David Melech Chai v'kayom. David, the king of Israel, is eternal. And yet, when David went with his armies to battle, there were casualties. There were casualties. However, Ahav, which we mentioned yesterday, was an evil king. He killed the majority of the prophets. He was an idolater. When he would go to battle, there was a divine protection. Nobody was killed in battle. So the Jerusalem Talmud asks why. Here we have people so devout and righteous. David HaMelech is the leader. They go to battle, they don't merit divine protection. And therefore they're casualties. This other man who's a pagan, and he killed prophets, when his armies go to war, they merit divine protection, no casualties. Why? So I gave you a little background. When he was made a purge of prophets, he had a courtier in this court. His name was Avaja, who himself was a prophet. He took 100 prophets and he put 50 in one cave and 50 in another cave. And that's why prophecy survived. Now, the question is, how's it possible you have so many people in hiding and you have to provide their amenities, basic amenities, food, water, whatever it is? Don't you think word would get out? Word should have gotten out and gotten back to Achav. And ultimately, he should have found it out and destroyed them. Why didn't it get back? Do you know why? Because people did not speak words which had any consequence to it. They were aware of it. Nobody said a word. The populace was aware of it. So what is that an expression of? We care about you. If that sharing information would cause them to be destroyed, we remain mum. We remain silent. So because they didn't speak Lashon Hara, and none of their speech was negative, despite the fact that pagans, God says, your people will merit divine protection. David's armies, even though they were devout, righteous, but in this area they weren't perfect. And because they were not perfect, they did speak negatively, had that negative part of the speech, therefore there were casualties. So what does that say? Give me the chesed, I'm not interested in the sacrifice. This is an expression of caring, because that's a unifying factor. And not only that, you're assuming the attribute of God. And when you assume the attribute of God, it has a very positive quality, effect. I'll give you an example. Father has two children. One child looks identical to the father. The other child doesn't. They both misbehave in the same way. All the body language of the child even looks like his father is exactly like the father's. Now it comes to reprimand each of his children. They both did the same thing wrong. The child that looks like the father and all the nuances of behavior like the father, it hurts his heart when he has to discipline the first child. The other one doesn't look like him. He says to his wife, "That's your child. Your child misbehaved. This is my child." He goes easy on the first one, because the first one reflects the father's characteristics and appearance. Lahavdil. If we assume that the attribute of Chesed, which is God's attribute, that's the basis and the impetus to create the world. Despite the fact that we misbehave and we have other beliefs, that's enough. That evokes the attribute of mercy of God. And God gives us chances and gives us opportunities because of that. Remember many years ago, I'm not going to record this. If somebody is very generous and you have a synagogue and you have an educational center and his name's on it, you say, this man must really value Torah education and Jewish prayer to give this kind of money to build a center, Torah center, and a synagogue. Okay? So the reading is, the takeaway is, he's a good Jew. Okay? And then all of a sudden you find out Cardinal Spellman asked him to build a church. And he built a church. Except that he wouldn't put his name on. But he built a church. So people say, Doesn't make sense. Here he builds this. So they said we misread it. It was a misreading. This man doesn't esteem and revere Judaism. He reveres members of the cloth. If you're a clergy, I'm there for you. Whether it's, and the Midrash says this, listen to the Midrash. There was a person, he offered hospitality one of a kind. Any rabbi who would need some kind of hospitality, hosting, he hosted him like royalty for 20 years. And people spoke about him in the most positive way. All of a sudden, the Pope comes to town. And he hosts the Pope identically, there's a Midrash, as he hosted all the rabbis. So they said, we had a misunderstanding of the man. It's not that he values rabbis, he values members of the cloth, whether it's the Pope or whether it's the rabbi, it's all the same. So the Midrash says, we find, God says, after the golden calf, build for me a mishkan, a sanctuary, so I should dwell in your midst. And he gives a list of all the materials that are needed: gold, silver, copper, 13 materials. Within one day, it was an enormous amount of wealth. The Jews gave all the material. That's impressive. The Jews really esteemed God. And one day, and he had to tell the people, stop bringing. The princes were nearly left out of the picture because they waited till the end. The Jews are really committed to God. So the Midrash says, it's not so simple. When Aaron said, let us gather gold to build the golden calf, how long did it take him to put it together, that gold? Like a blink of an eye, they had all the gold there. So if you only know the story of the Mishkan, you say, this is very impressive. But if you know the story of the golden calf, it's the identical behavior. So what is the Jew? The Jew is a giver. Whether it's the devil or Havdil, whether it's God, the Jew gives. He's on the giving, he's in the giving mode. And that's the Jew. It's just a question, in what direction you put the Jew? You put him to the right, he gives. You put him to the left, he sports that. Because the Jew innately has that characteristic to give, to do chesed. And it's not difficult for the Jew to give. Other people, it's like tearing a pound of flesh out of them. There's always this inertia. They can't get themselves to give. I remember going back a long time ago. Must have been 1965, 64. When the yeshiva was in the old neighborhood in Baltimore. So there was a certain Jew. He already was in his mid-80s. And he would come to the yeshiva once a year on his father's yard site to say Kaddish. Say Kaddish. He was so old, maybe he was in his 90s, he couldn't keep his tongue in his mouth. People very old, they can't keep their tongues in their mouth. And he'd have a chauffeur who wore a chauffeur uniform, like with that cap, would hold him under his arm, bring him into the back of the base medrash. They'd sit him down, and he would wait for Kaddish. He would say Kaddish. And outside, he had this black Cadillac that the chauffeur would drive. He was a widower at the time. Must have been upper 80s, 90s. So the man then was one of the wealthiest Jews in Baltimore. This is the 60s. He was worth maybe $50 million. And he had a check prepared to donate to the yeshiva for the yard site of his father. He wrote the check, like $18 check, and he had it in his pocket, out of the pocket of his jacket. He says to the executive director, I have difficulty putting my hand in my pocket to give it to you. Could you take it out? Put your hand in my pocket, take it. Because I'm not a giver. I'm paid when I have to give away money. You got it? He said, the man's a sick man. Can't give. And he explained to one of the rabbis, who had some kind of relationship, he admits it's like an illness. If he has it, can't give it away. but you take it to the grave. Doesn't make a difference. Can't separate from it. This is out of the ordinary. And the more questions this type of situation. You have to check the man's pedigree. If initially he comes from the original Jew, maybe there's some convert that married into the family. Because if he's an authentic Jew from the very beginning, the attributes of Avram was to do Chesed. Therefore, this behavior is contradictory to that. It's not possible. It's very interesting. Very often, and I mentioned that somebody was studying with a certain rabbi, and he told the rabbi, and he enjoyed it tremendously. And he said to her, I have to stop learning. Why do I have to stop learning? Because I enjoy it so much, and it resonates with me so much. I'm going to become an Orthodox Jew, an observant Jew. And if I do, I have a wife who's not coming on board. I have children, they're not coming on board. If that's the case, I'm going to have to divorce my wife, and I'm going to alienate my children. I prefer not to know the truth and remain not observant than put everything into jeopardy. This is what he said. He shared this with the rabbi, and he stopped learning. If you're giving to other people, when a person himself doesn't accept many things, because on a subliminal level, he understands there can be consequences. But if a person has no problem giving, and I can identify with you, as long as you're a Jew, easily identify with you. More observant, less observant, non-observant doesn't make a difference. You're a Jew. Therefore, I give you value. Once I give you value, I'm willing to listen to what you have to say.